makes perfect. Practice makes icons, it seems like. Um, that's the story. Welcome to Puffs of Thought. Today I'd like to discuss the film The Clark Sisters, the First Ladies of Gospel, and go through some interesting themes and the good, bad, and ugly of the film. Let's get started. First things first, let's give a huge shout out to these actresses and actor in the cast. I mean, there's several in the film, but I just want to highlight just a few because they made this story so real for me, and I was absolutely ready to hate and love every and anyone. We have Ajahnay Ellis, and I hope that I'm doing her name justice, who played Miss Maddie Moss Clark. Raven Goodwin, who played Denise. Shalea Frazier, who played Dorinda. Christina Bell, who played Twinkie. Angela Burchett, who played Jackie. Kira Kiki Sheard, who played Karen, her mother. So I'm sure that was a unique experience for her. And we have Demore Barnes, who played Elbert Clark. And needless to say, he played that role very, very well. Having the living legends that are inspiring the film present and guiding how things come across is so significant because, as we've seen in the past, just from a viewer standpoint, when the family or the person who the film is about does not completely stand by the film, it completely flops. These actors could not only act, but they could sing. Okay? If you listen to the original of some of these records and then you listen to the soundtrack, it's uncanny. It's practically like you're watching the Clark sisters together. And a common phrase that you heard in the film was to have one voice. We're talking about 5 women that sound like an entire choral group, okay? Massively tight harmony. Amazing. Now, for someone like myself who had a superficial understanding of the Clark sisters up until this point, I only knew a few Kiki songs. Again, the daughter of Karen Sheard, a few Karen Sheard songs, and Blessed and Highly Favored was as far as my knowledge of the Clark sisters have gone. But now I can fully understand why so many artists like Beyonce have looked to the Clark sisters as vocal inspiration, because there's something so incredible about being able to have your own unique voice but mesh so well in a group. And for any of you out there who may not have any vocal training, it's a difficult feat. Another good benefit on the music side of all of this was really getting an understanding of how vital Twinkie was to the group. Not only was she the pianist, but she was the composer for a crazy amount of the Clark sisters' discography. She's credited with writing most of their songs, and that in itself is a feat. By the end of the film, we find out that Twinkie was responsible for writing over 250 songs in her life. And that's just up until now. Who's to say when there's a song on her heart again if she'll pick up her pen? I mean, it's magic. So, more for the good. Such interesting tropes and archetypes that we see play out throughout the film. We see a strong lead with Dr. Maddie Moss Clark, the mother of all the young ladies, and she is a visionary and an ambitious woman. She loves her God, she loves her children, and she loves music. And ultimately, music is what gives her her independence that so many who've experienced abuse and domestic violence don't have. So we see her in a situation where she has to deal with patriarchy in 1960. And we also see this idea of traditional Christian values stifling her growth and her development and her desire to use music to spread the gospel. Gospel music always has to deal with a lot of people criticizing the way in which musicians go about making records. For those who are a little more experimental, the Mary Marys, the Kirk Franklins, people argue that their music is a little too secular. It plays on the fringes just a little too much. And unfortunately for Dr. Maddie Moss Clark, in her time of bringing her girls up and encouraging them to go forth, they had to deal with that traditionalist thought, not performing, at the Grammys, not wanting them to, be seen, essentially. And even though there's a level of celebrity that happens when you become a singer on that level, you get nominated for awards at that level, you perform nationally syndicated shows, there still is a benefit, because people who may have never heard of gospel are now interested. And for me, gospel music is what got me going to church in high school. I didn't grow up completely immersed in church culture. At one point, I was the only one choosing to go because it wasn't a requirement for my household. And I would bring myself into the house of God, and what kept me there was the music. And that's the power of it. Another trope that we see is this codependent and also black sheep scapegoat archetype that we see in the family unit. So once Dr. Maddie Moss is able to separate herself from her abusive husband, her husband who rejects her ambition, who rejects her desire to share music and to develop musical talent in her kids, we see that the dynamic with her daughters isn't all the same across the board, which is understandable. You have different personalities and a different way for a mother to interact with her kids. Straight out the gate, I have this inkling that Dorinda is one of the favorites and Karen is one of the favorites, and Jackie idolizes her mother and is the first daughter she's had, and their relationship is very strong. There's a level of bond there, there's a level of trust there. Being able to go to your daughter and her understand some of your woes in a way that maybe you wouldn't share with your youngest. According to the film, Denise is the first daughter who is born a Clark. We understand that Jackie was from a previous relationship with Dr. Maddie Moss. Denise doesn't want to live her life completely on the straight path and narrow. And that's understandable for a lot of people who grew up traditionally religious. There's a lot of rules. There's a lot of expectations on you, especially if you're a preacher's kid, which the children were. Their father was a pastor in their church. And there's a great expectation that you're singing the gospel. Your mother goes from church to church, working to share her vocal training with these choirs as her job. and you are performing live, eventually trying to sell records, it's expected that you're going to live the life that you're singing to everyone else about. And I think that was really hard for Denise as a young woman to try to match up her desire to explore, to self-discover, to pick her own path, and to forge her own way. And excuse me, little cell phone. It was just really hard for her to do everything that was pleasing to her mother. And I think it was challenging for her in a way that wasn't exactly challenging for a few of her other sisters. It seemed like Dorinda and Karen and Jackie didn't struggle that much with just following the rules. And that's of no fault to Denise or to, damage her character, but people are different. And that's the problem with really strict religious upbringings, because it creates this opportunity for people to be the scapegoat, for people to be the black sheep, or to feel left out or emotionally neglected. Because the reality is, just because this makes sense to you and this is easy for you doesn't mean it's easy for me. I want to go out. I want to live. And unfortunately, going against the grain created a lot more resentment in Denise and made the relationship with her mother just a little bit more tumultuous. So here's some more of the good that can blend on in with the ugly, and that's Twinkie's relationship with her mother. And this is where I wonder if there was some codependency there. Now, granted, I'm not a psychologist. I don't purport myself to be one, and I can't understand all the ins and outs of, a black sheep syndrome, even though I know that that's not a medical term. It's just an archetype that we often see play out in people's lives and in their family units. And I can't say for sure that Twinkie is completely codependent, but I do think that because her gift and her talent that in some way was curated by her mother, because she taught her the fundamentals of piano and encouraged her to continue on with it. Her needing her mother so desperately to approve of her, as I think they all did, and I think any kid would want their mother to approve of them and to favor them, it created an inability for Twinkie to stand on her own and to have things of her own. And as the film progresses, we see that once she's in her adulthood, she yearns to have something of her own, and it causes her to make really bad mistakes, financial mistakes, and then mistakes in her relationship, mistakes that could have been avoided, and that's an assumption, but could have been avoided if she was given that independence. When you're overly sheltered and you lack the opportunity to stand out on your own and to make decisions on your own and to meet different kinds of men, understand different personalities, you may end up settling for what you shouldn't settle for. So in the film, and I'm not sure how much of this film is an inspiration of or based on, because inspiration doesn't have to be completely factual. And although the Clark sisters are behind this film, it doesn't mean that everything that comes out is completely factual and happened exactly the way it happened. And so we can assume that there was challenges with Twinkie and her husband at some point over finances. We see that he approached her knowing exactly who she was, and won her favor in that way, and then sought to isolate her by encouraging her to leave the Clark sisters as a group and to move from Detroit, where her family is, all the way to North Carolina. And when we see that with abusers or manipulators, that they try to isolate you from your family because your family has your back. Your family is usually a voice of reason, and especially separating her from her mother, who seems to have a level of wisdom and discernment and a level of control just maybe, maybe that codependence, and I'm throwing it out there, maybe that codependence for both of them was crippling. Because as the film goes on, we find out that Twinkie was supposed to graduate from Howard University. But Dr. Maddie wanted her daughter to go with her from state to state, choir to choir, working, playing the organ, teaching songs. I'm not sure exactly what Twinkie went to school for because they didn't really mention it in the film, if I'm not mistaken. But that would have been something that is an accomplishment. It feels good to start something and finish it. It feels good to say, this is something that I worked for and I accomplished. And although she has that within the scope of the Clark sisters, as we hear later on from the way her character is portrayed, that's not enough because that's shared. That's not Twinkie's thing. That's our thing. And that's hard. And that creates a level of vulnerability. It creates a desire to be seen. And that's what this husband did for her. He saw her when it seemed like no one else did. And he chose her and wanted her separate from the family. And maybe to a certain degree, she desired that. And so, let's get into the bad of this film. There were a few things that confused me just a little bit about the plot. And it seemed like even in these 2 hours and I think 30 minutes of the film, there was still a lack of oomph, like something was missing. Like if we were all being left on a hook and weren't completely getting the whole story. So another theme that we see in the film is regret and suicide, ideation, grief. And although that was very powerful for me, I think it would have been even more powerful to understand exactly what was the thought processes that Dorinda, who supposedly had the suicide ideation per the film, what was her thought processes at that point? There isn't much dialogue. She's unable to support her other sisters at this time. They just lost their mother in the film. Dr. Maddie Moss passed away from an illness that hasn't really been described. That's another bad. I can only assume it's diabetes or something that will cause you to lose your limbs. And we're left to assume because there's no detail on that. And then we see that Twinkie's character is in such immense grief because she has severed her ties with her mother. And now that her mom's gone, there's no repairing that bond. The mind is a fragile place, and you mix in grief and you'll be surprised on how that can impact a person. And so we see a mental break with Twinkie. We see that Jackie, the responsible sister, the oldest sister, the one who went and got a nursing degree or a nursing certificate, or however that goes, because I'm not sure whether she was officially a nurse throughout the entire film or if that happened over time, but she always worked in healthcare from the adulthood version of the cast members until the end of the film. We see her taking responsibility for Twinkie, watching out for her. We see her overextending herself with work and her own family. And we see Dorinda crumble, and we see her contemplate suicide, which was a very impactful scene. And I think it's really hard to imagine people that seem so perfect. You know, these are the first ladies of gospel. They've pioneered the gospel genre. They brought it to the mainstream. They're credited with so much, and they've had immeasurable pain in their lives, just like everybody else. So despite the touring, despite the Grammy nods, they're still human and they still have trials and tribulations. And I'm so glad that despite the ideation, that Dorinda got whatever revelation she needed to get, got whatever spiritual awakening she needed to get, and did not go through with it. So for anyone who ever stumbles across this video, please call this number below in case you ever need help. The film did a great job of depicting that dynamic of Denise feeling left out, of her kind of having to support her own self and her own emotions and feelings because no one quite understood what she was going through or the way she viewed the world. One scene that really stuck out to me is when Denise had finally decided that she wanted to verbalize her pain in front of her family. And unfortunately for them, she wanted to do this when they were signing a record contract that Dr. Mattie Moss had negotiated for them. And she did not want to be a part of the Clark sisters any longer. And Dr. Mattie Moss asked Denise, "Why do you hate me?" And I think that was an eye-opener for everyone watching of how things can be perceived, you know? It seemed as if the perception was that because Denise didn't want to live her life on the straight and narrow and make the absolutely perfect decisions all the time, that there was a hatred there for her mother, when really it's just a desire to be her own person and to still be loved and respected and valued as a family member, even if she doesn't fit everything, you know. And that's verbalized later on. Dorinda's character says, you know, "You are so hard to love." And what I thought was the perfect statement to combat such an insensitive comment was, y'all aren't perfect. None of you are perfect. And I'm paraphrasing all of these lines. None of you are perfect, but you're not hard to love because you're my sisters. Hey, that says it all right there. And I love the raw honesty about how these sisters relate to one another. And I would hope that watching this film back would be enough to mend any bad blood between them. So there isn't much ugliness within the film as it's constructed, but more so ugliness that the Clark sisters and Dr. Mattie Moss had to face on their own. Patriarchy, restrictive traditional Christian values that try to limit the opportunities that these women had. We see that Dr. Mattie Moss Clark acted as, I think, the International Music Department director. I hope I'm saying that right. And that was for her denomination, the Kojic Church, for the bishops. And she was strongly encouraged that if she wanted to keep her position, that she would no longer perform with her daughters ever, which seemed very rough and unfair to her in the film because we only see her perform with her daughters once. She's not a performer, she's a lead, a director. She guides the worship, praise and worship experience as a professional, and her daughters excitedly, you know, invited her on stage for the Grammys to perform with them, which completely makes sense. I mean, how many people bring their parents to the Grammys or the Emmys or whatever other award shows there are when they get to that level? You may only go to this place once in your life because we've seen it happen. Not everyone who wins a Grammy this year is going to win one, you know, the next few years in a row. And we know that's not the case for these young women, but still, it was just really rough to see. And it's a part of the reason why I think a lot of people of my generation, young millennials and then Gen Zers who are coming up now, have a hard time seeing themselves in more traditional religious groups, because this idea that if I don't look, act, and think the way that you do, that I'm not valuable, or I don't have anything to offer to the church, it makes it really difficult to exist in that. And this is why a lot of people have church hurt, and this is why a lot of people turn around and rather have their own relationship with God outside of a church family. And that's something that churches have been struggling with and have been trying. How do you balance doctrine and expectations and non-negotiables, and how do you allow people to be people and to experience life on their own terms? Because a part of this Christian walk is to have choice. If there was no choice, then we would grow to resent it. As we see in the film, we see that there is a resentment of musicianship. There's a resentment of being an artist, because Denise felt like she never really had a choice. From the beginning of the film, 3 o'clock in the morning, 8, 9 years old young ladies getting woken out of their sleep to practice harmonies. Out of the other children, Denise seemed to be the one who wasn't up for it. And although there's a desire for all kids to please their parents, again, people are individuals, and that could have been just too much for her. Now, fast forward 20 years later, she's still doing the same thing. I mean, it's hard. It's hard to live a life that you didn't choose every step of the way. You see it with the Michael Jackson experience. We saw that with them in their film and in their accounts of their childhood, is that career path was forced upon them. And although it seems like they've all done pretty well in the end in terms of making it to superstardom and being artists and being creatives, I'm sure there's immeasurable trauma from that, from not being able to live life the way you would have chose. We see that every weekend the girls sing. Every weekend they sing. And that's rough. That's rough. And although it makes greatness, practice makes perfect. Practice makes icons, it seems like. That's the story. That's the challenge.